everyone, and welcome to another deep dive. Today we're going to be wading into the waters of Baptist denominations, and specifically what makes Reformed Baptists unique. Now, before we get started, let me just say that even though all Baptists share some core beliefs, right? Like believer's baptism, the authority of the Bible, and that each church should govern itself. There's still a lot of diversity within that framework.
Absolutely.
So today we're going to be looking at this really interesting article called How Are Reformed Baptists Different from Other Baptists? To kind of unpack those differences and give you a clearer picture of the Baptist landscape.
It's a fascinating landscape.
It is.
And I think one of the biggest differences you'll find right away is how Reformed Baptists and other Baptists approach the idea of salvation.
Okay.
Reformed Baptists subscribe to what's called Calvinistic theology, which is often represented by the acronym TULIP.
Ah, yes, TULIP. I remember learning about that in seminary, but could you give us like a quick refresher on what that means?
Yeah, sure. TULIP stands for total depravity,
Okay.
unconditional election, limited atonement, irresistible grace, and perseverance of the saints.
Okay.
Now, it might sound a little complicated,
Yeah.
but it essentially emphasizes God's sovereignty in salvation.
Gotcha.
So Reformed Baptists, following this system, believe that because of sin, humans are completely incapable of choosing God on their own.
Oh, interesting.
It's God's grace that draws us to him.
So God is the one choosing, not us, in that view.
That's right. And that's where we start to see a big difference from a lot of other Baptists who lean more towards Arminianism.
Okay, now how would you say Arminianism differs from that?
Well, Arminianism puts a lot of emphasis on free will.
Okay.
It suggests that we as humans have the capacity to accept or reject God's offer of salvation.
Right.
So it's not solely up to God in this view.
So it's really about who initiates salvation, God or the individual.
Yeah, you got it.
And I imagine that has a ripple effect.
Absolutely.
That affects a lot more than just this one theological point.
Oh yeah, it influences everything from how they read and interpret the Bible to the way they organize their leadership structures.
And speaking of which, our source actually points out that Reformed Baptists tend to gravitate toward those very specific, very detailed doctrinal statements.
Yeah.
And it specifically mentions the 1689 Baptist Confession of Faith.
Yeah, the 1689 Confession is really key for them.
It is.
It outlines their understanding of Reformed theology really, really thoroughly.
Okay.
It shows their commitment to a systematic approach to their faith.
Yeah, a very structured approach.
Exactly.
Now, how does that compare to what other Baptist groups might have as their doctrinal statements?
Well, some other Baptist groups might use simpler statements of faith.
Okay.
Like the Baptist Faith and Message is one example.
Right.
Or some might not even use a formal confession at all.
Interesting. So they're sort of choosing to maybe navigate by these like bigger guiding principles,
Right.
as opposed to having this super detailed theological roadmap.
I think that's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
And that difference, that preference for detail or for broader strokes, it actually extends to how they approach the Bible itself.
Yeah.
Because all Baptists see the Bible as the ultimate authority, right? But their methods for actually reading and interpreting it can be really different.
Okay. Now, I know our source mentions that Reformed Baptists lean towards something called a covenantal framework. Could you explain what that means exactly?
Sure. So basically, a covenantal framework means they see the whole Bible as this unified story, God's work through these covenants or these agreements with humanity. So they're always looking for those connections throughout the entire text.
So they're trying to see the big overarching themes that run through the Old and New Testament.
Precisely. They really believe that every single part of the Bible contributes to this larger narrative.
Okay, that makes sense. But our source also mentions that some other Baptists hold a dispensational view.
Right.
And how does that differ from the covenantal view?
Well, a dispensational view divides history into these different periods or dispensations, and they believe God interacts with us differently in each of these periods.
Interesting.
So it's more about the distinctions between those periods rather than that unified overarching story.
So for instance, like the way God interacts in the Old Testament might be seen as fundamentally different from the New Testament.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And of course, that can lead to some pretty different interpretations on things like prophecy or the role of Israel in God's plan.
It seems like it could lead to some very different conclusions.
Oh, absolutely.
Even though both groups are starting with the same text.
You're exactly right. And that's something we see play out in a lot of different areas of church life, too.
Yeah.
From leadership structures to even the elements they include in their worship services.
Right, right.
It's fascinating, really.
Okay, so we've been talking about how these different ways of thinking about theology and interpreting the Bible can really impact how Baptists actually practice their faith.
Yeah, for sure.
But how do these differences play out, in the day-to-day life of the church? Like, let's start with leadership, for example.
That's a good one. It's a great example of how these ideas have real practical effects.
Right.
So Reformed Baptists, drawing on what they see in the New Testament,
Yeah.
they tend to favor a system where you have a group of elders leading the congregation.
Okay, so I'm imagining like what we read in Acts, right?
Right.
Where you have these multiple leaders all kind of sharing the responsibility of shepherding the church.
Yeah, exactly. It's about shared leadership and accountability.
Right.
And this is pretty different from the model that you find in a lot of other Baptist churches, which is more congregational, where they make decisions by majority vote.
Right, so it's more of a democratic approach.
Right.
So what would you say are some of the arguments that Reformed Baptists might make in favor of that elder-led model?
Well, they often emphasize the importance of having spiritually mature leaders.
Right.
Leaders who are qualified, as described in places like 1 Timothy or Titus.
Okay.
People who can guide the church, teach the church.
Right.
They also often say it's a more stable form of leadership compared to a system where things can kind of shift and change based on who's voting.
Right, you have less consistency.
Exactly.
Yeah. It's really interesting to see how those convictions about biblical authority and how to interpret it really directly inform the way they organize themselves.
That all connects.
Yeah, absolutely. And it also affects, as we said, their worship.
Oh, yeah.
I know that Reformed Baptists often follow what's called the regulative principle of worship.
Right.
Now, I've heard that term before, but could you break that down for us a little bit?
Sure. The regulative principle basically says that only those elements that are specifically commanded in the Bible should be included in worship services.
Okay.
So typically this means they focus on preaching, singing psalms, prayer, observing the sacrament.
So it's a much more, I guess you could say, minimalist approach, stripping it down to the bare essentials, what they see as the biblical essentials.
Right. And that's in contrast to what's called the normative principle, which a lot of other Baptists follow.
And how does that differ?
The normative principle says that anything that's not specifically forbidden in Scripture is allowed.
Oh, okay, so it's a much broader view.
It is, yeah.
So things like contemporary music or more dramatic presentations, those would be okay under that view.
Yeah, things like that.
Interesting. So what would you say are some of the arguments that Reformed Baptists might have against that normative principle?
Well, they're often concerned about introducing things into worship that aren't, explicitly from the Bible.
Right, those man-made elements.
Exactly. Because they feel like that can distract from the focus on God and His Word.
Yeah.
And they also worry that, when churches are constantly trying to keep up with what's current or trendy, that they might end up compromising the timeless truths of the gospel.
Right. It really is a fundamental question, isn't it?
It is.
About how we view the relationship between scripture, tradition, and modern culture.
Absolutely. You put it perfectly. And I think that leads into another important distinction that our source brings up, which is this emphasis in Reformed Baptist circles on personal holiness.
Okay.
And this idea of coram Deo, which is Latin for before the face of God.
Right. So living your whole life with that awareness that you're always in God's presence.
Yeah. So it's about taking your faith beyond Sunday morning and letting it shape every part of your life.
So how does that actually look in practice? What are some examples of how that plays out?
Well, it could be a lot of different things.
Yeah.
How you spend your free time, what you choose to watch or listen to, how you engage in your community, how you act at work even.
Right.
It's about recognizing that everything you do, every part of your life, is lived under the lordship of Christ.
It sounds like it would involve some pretty tough choices sometimes.
It often does.
Yeah, going against the grain.
Yeah, definitely. But the goal is to live in a way that honors God.
Right.
Even when it's difficult.
Okay, so just to be clear, are you saying that other Baptists don't care about holiness?
Oh, no, not at all.
Okay.
I think a lot of Baptists, no matter what their tradition is, would say it's important to live out their faith in their daily lives. But the focus might be different. Like some churches might really prioritize evangelism, for example.
Oh, okay.
Or social justice work, whereas Reformed Baptists tend to really emphasize personal piety and spiritual disciplines.
So it's more about like where the emphasis is placed.
Yeah, that's it.
And maybe the specific methods they use.
Right.
But not necessarily a disagreement about the value of living a Christ-like life.
Exactly. Yeah, I think that's a good way to sum it up. We're really talking about different expressions of the same faith, you know?
Yeah, different flavors.
Yeah, and I think it shows how even these subtle theological distinctions can lead to really diverse ways of living out your Christian faith.
It really does.
Even within something like the Baptist denomination, which people think of as being pretty unified.
Right, exactly.
It's pretty amazing.
It underscores how complex and how rich, really, Christianity is.
Yeah, and it reminds us that it's so important to understand those little nuances
It is.
so we can talk to other believers in a meaningful way,
Yeah,
even if we don't see eye to eye on every single detail.
absolutely. And, it's not about saying one approach is right or one approach is wrong. It's about appreciating the different ways that people live out their faith.
It is. We're all part of the same body.
Right.
And we can learn from each other.
Absolutely. And before we wrap up, I just want to re-emphasize that this deep dive has been about exploring the differences between these groups.
Yeah.
Not about saying one is better or more authentic or anything like that.
Right. Ultimately, what unites us is way bigger.
Yeah.
It's our faith in Jesus, our desire to follow him.
Mm-hmm.
These are differences in emphasis and interpretation,
Yeah.
not fundamental disagreements about the gospel.
Yeah. And recognizing that can help build more understanding, I think.
Absolutely.
More unity in the Christian community as a whole.
Yeah, for sure. This has been a really interesting conversation,
It has.
exploring all these subtle but significant differences within the Baptist world.
Yeah. It really makes you think about how these different approaches impact people,
It does.
how they see the world, the choices they make.
Right. Their whole lives, really.
Yeah. Definitely gives us a lot to think about.
It does.
And maybe even encourages us to look at our own beliefs.
Mhm.
Think about how they line up with Scripture, how they shape our own relationship with Christ.
Yeah. Always good to reflect on that.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for taking us on this deep dive into the world of Reformed Baptists.
Oh, it's been my pleasure.
It's been really enlightening.
Always happy to talk about this stuff.
And to all our listeners, thanks for joining us on another deep dive.
Yes. Thanks, everyone.
We'll catch you next time.